Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be diving into something a little bit heavier than our usual topics,
Mm.
but it's something that's so important. We're going to be talking about the legacy of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a book that really digs deep into how these patterns, these cycles of abuse, can actually repeat themselves generation after generation,
Right.
and really importantly, how we can break free.
It's understandable if you're listening to this and you're feeling maybe some difficult emotions coming up. But, like we always say, knowledge is power. And even just understanding the dynamics of how this all works, that in itself can be a huge step towards healing.
Yeah.
This is not about blame. This is about awareness and hope.
For sure. And one of the things I think that this book does so well is it addresses what it calls this uncomfortable truth. And it
Uh-huh.
speaks directly to you, the listener. It says, if you've experienced abuse, if you've experienced neglect, it does have an impact on you, even if it feels like it's far in the past.
Yeah.
And it impacts you in ways that you might not even realize
Mm.
in your reactions, your behaviors, even just in how you see the world.
Yeah, it gets woven into the fabric of who we are, even if it's on a subconscious level, right?
Yeah.
And I think what's really important about how the book approaches this is it's not about guilt tripping you.
Right.
It's about recognizing that these past experiences, even the ones that we think we've totally buried and dealt with, they can still have a really profound influence on who we are today and how we show up in the world.
Definitely.
So it's about shining a light on those maybe subconscious patterns so we can understand them and ultimately start to change them.
Yeah. The book has all of these different stories.
Mhm.
And I was really struck by the story of Nicole. So Nicole, she desperately wanted a child. And then when she had her daughter, she really struggled to bond with her. It was like she was mirroring the coldness that she had experienced from her own mother.
Mhm.
It really showed how deeply these patterns can run,
Mm.
right?
That example of Nicole's, it really speaks to this broader principle that we see again and again, both in the research and in, folks who work with people who've experienced this. These early childhood experiences, particularly those related to attachment, to bonding with your early caregivers, it can have this ripple effect that extends way into adulthood.
Right.
And so for Nicole, her early experience of parental coldness, you can imagine how that impacts her own ability to form secure attachments later in life, which then plays out in her relationship with her own child.
It's a really helpful way to frame it. And the book, like I said, it has all these different stories. Another one that really stuck with me was Peggy.
Hmm.
Peggy felt like she was constantly attracting abusive partners, almost like she was an abuser magnet.
Right.
And it's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
but it's a pattern that I think we see so often.
Absolutely. And while, of course, every individual's experience is unique, Peggy's story really highlights how past trauma can actually distort our lens, right?
Yeah.
Making us more likely to end up in these situations that almost mirror our past pain. It's almost like we're seeking out what's familiar, even if it's harmful.
So it's not just about becoming an abuser yourself,
Yeah.
which is what a lot of people, I think, might initially think of when we hear about the cycle of abuse.
Exactly. The legacy of abuse, it can manifest in so many different ways. Some are more subtle, some are less obvious. It can show up in our difficulty regulating our emotions, our struggles with intimacy,
Yeah.
our tendency to want to control every situation, or conversely, being overly submissive, even just the way we view ourselves and the world around us, it can impact all these different areas.
It's like these ripples spreading out from a central point of impact.
Right. And it's important to understand that a lot of times these are trauma responses. These
Yeah.
aren't character flaws.
Yeah.
So when we go through abuse, when we experience neglect, our brains, our bodies, they develop these coping mechanisms to help us survive, right? That's what we're meant to do. We're meant to survive.
All right.
But those same mechanisms, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, those can actually become obstacles to healthy relationships and emotional well-being later in life.
Okay. So we're starting to get into some of the psychological mechanisms at play here.
Yeah,
I think before we go any further, it might be helpful to define a couple of terms.
sure.
We keep talking about things like emotional regulation
Mm.
and secure attachments. Could you break those down a little bit for folks who might not be familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. So emotional regulation, you can think about it as our ability to manage our emotions in healthy ways. So it's being able to identify them, understand them, and respond to our feelings without being totally overwhelmed by them.
Hmm.
Secure attachment, on the other hand, that refers to that strong emotional bond that we form with our primary caregivers, right, in early childhood. And when that bond is secure, it provides us with a sense of safety, a sense of trust, a sense of belonging, and that carries over into our adult relationships.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And it highlights why these early experiences are just so crucial.
Absolutely. And you can imagine when those early experiences are disrupted by abuse or neglect, it can have this cascade of effects on our ability to regulate our emotions and form healthy attachments later on.
It's like that foundation is shaky, right?
Exactly, exactly.
And the book had another story, Janice. So Janice, she vowed to be different from her mother, but then she found herself using those same harsh words with her daughter that had been used on her.
Wow.
And it's like it was this instinctive reaction, even when we know better.
Janice's experience, it really highlights this phenomenon known as repetition compulsion,
Okay.
which is basically this unconscious tendency to repeat past trauma, often in an attempt to gain some sense of control over it. It's like we're trying to rewrite that script, we're trying to change the ending, but unconsciously we end up playing out these same roles even if they're causing us pain.
It's like we're trapped in this cycle, replaying this broken record over and over again.
Yeah.
But the book also makes it clear that it's not inevitable. We can break free.
We absolutely can. And understanding how these cycles work, that's the first step.
Okay. So I think that's a great place to pause for now. In the next part of this deep dive, we're going to explore some of those less obvious ways that this legacy of abuse can show up in our lives.
Mm.
And then we're going to delve into those tools, those strategies for actually breaking free.
I'm looking forward to it. This is important stuff. So, like we were saying before the break, sometimes these legacies of abuse show up in ways that aren't as in your face. It's not always about, becoming abusive ourselves.
Yeah.
It's like these echoes of the past, they can kind of reverberate in all these unexpected corners of our lives. And the book gave some really interesting examples of this. Like, what were some of those less obvious ways these legacies can play out?
Well, one thing that they highlighted was how past trauma can really warp our perceptions of the people around us. Like we start seeing partners, our kids even, colleagues through this lens of suspicion, distrust. You always kind of bracing ourselves for that abandonment or betrayal.
Even when it's totally unwarranted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if your early experiences taught you that the world is not safe, that people can't be trusted,
Mm-hmm.
it makes sense that you'd carry that into your adult relationships.
Absolutely. It's like we're constantly on high alert, Our nervous systems are just stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode,
Mhm.
always scanning for danger, even when we're in a relatively safe environment.
Right.
And you can imagine that kind of hypervigilance. It's incredibly draining, not just for us, but for the people that we're close to as well.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard to relax, to be vulnerable, to really build that genuine intimacy.
And what about those control issues that we were talking about before? How do those kind of fit into this?
Well, the book explains that people who have experienced abuse, neglect, they often develop these really unhealthy coping mechanisms around control. It's like they're trying to regain a sense of agency, in a world that felt really chaotic and unpredictable.
Mhm.
So they might swing between, feeling this intense need to micromanage and dominate every situation, or they might go the complete opposite way and become overly submissive, always trying to please others, avoid conflict at all costs.
Almost like this pendulum swing between these two extremes.
Yeah, yeah.
Either desperately trying to grasp control to prevent being hurt,
Hmm.
or just totally surrendering control because they feel like they're powerless to change anything.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And both of those extremes, they can really wreak havoc on relationships
Right.
because it creates this fundamental imbalance. It prevents that healthy give and take, that sense of mutual respect and agency that's so essential for a truly strong connection.
The book is the example of Tracy. And Tracy kept ending up in these relationships with controlling partners.
Mm.
And it wasn't until she really started digging into her past that she realized why this kept happening.
Right. And for Tracy, she had experienced a lot of emotional neglect from her father growing up. And so she had this deep-seated need for love and approval. And she was drawn to partners who initially showered her with that attention, but then very quickly became possessive and jealous, trying to control her every move.
It's like we're unconsciously seeking out what we lacked in childhood.
Right.
But then we end up recreating that same pain.
Yeah.
It's in a different form.
It's so, so true. And, it's tragic.
Mm-hmm.
But it also underscores how incredibly important it is to really understand these underlying dynamics so we can break free from them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if we're not aware of how our past is shaping our present, we're just going to keep bumping into those same patterns, those same pitfalls over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this book's focus on breaking the cycle is so crucial. It doesn't just leave us with this weight of, understanding our past. It gives us these concrete tools and strategies for creating real and lasting change.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that up because honestly, learning about all this stuff is fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also feel really overwhelming. So,
Yeah.
so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's dive into those tools for actually breaking the cycle. Like, where does the book even suggest we begin?